Yes, thank you, and good evening, everyone. So it's my great pleasure to have to welcome here Professor James Dennison for this public lecture organized by the NCCR and the Move. James is a part-time professor at the Migration Policy Center of the European University Institute, and he's also a researcher at the University of East Anglia. And his research mainly focuses on political attitudes, psychology and behavior, and the politics of migration. So it's very much in line to what we have seen together. We had a core course on attitudes, on perceptions, and on the governance of migration. And his work primarily covers Europe, but I think also the Middle East and North African region. So tonight he will present for us a lecture that is called Recent Development and Advances in Understanding Attitudes to Immigration. So he will review findings and propose integrated model. And also see a little bit, show us a little bit where all these findings can lead us for the future. So I very much look forward to listening to you. You will have about 45-50 minutes for your talk. Then we will open the room for a Q&A session. Also, maybe online. I see that some people are participating online. You can raise your virtual hands, and I will try to keep track of the questions or comments that come from online. So without further ado, I will give you the word, James, for your lecture, and thanks for having accepted our invitation.
Thank you very much, Robin, for the really nice introduction, and also thank you very much to Sarah for organizing and inviting me to come here. It's my first time in Neuchâtel, and I must say my main thought right now is that I'm a little bit intimidated that you had a whole course on attitudes and perceptions to immigration. So I hope that nothing I say, I hope it's not a little bit too basic for you, but anyway. So even though this was advertised as a lecture, and I'm happy for it to be a lecture, given that it's a fairly small group, and given that you're quite an informed audience, it seems like, please, I think it's always great if you raise your hand at any point during the lecture, and we can take the whole thing at our own pace to some extent. So anyway, without further ado from my side, as Robin says, this lecture is called Recent Developments and Advances in Understanding Attitudes to Immigration. And as such, the lecture is a little bit of a hodgepodge. So forgive me in that respect, but I think it can be useful both as a way to have a broad overview of the academic literature, a broad overview of the empirical reality, to the extent that surveys can give us that reality, in Europe, at least right now, and then sort of, from a certain degree of vanity, I'm going to present very quickly or fairly basically 3 recent papers that have come out, and then go into a bit more depth on some data I just got last week that I'm quite excited by, because to a large extent, it contradicts a lot of what I've been saying and other people have been saying in the last 10 years or so on attitudes to immigration by taking a novel approach. Okay, so the first of these, as I say, this might be a little bit basic for you guys, but I'm going to go through it anyway. And if it's too simple, then feel free to push me along. So I'm just going to start with a little bit of basic cross data over time in terms of attitudes to immigration at the most basic abstract level across Europe in the last 6 or 7 years. So this starts with the first question from the Eurobarometer. Every member state, Switzerland, UK, a few accession countries as well, are asked, does immigration from other EU member states conjure up a positive or negative feeling for you? And we can see here, see if this works. Yeah, this is the European Union average. So what we have on the left here, these axes from -100 to 100, is the net positivity. So it's the number of people saying that they have a positive feeling minus the number of people who say they have a negative feeling. So what that means is if you have 0, which is where the line is, the dark line, then that means there's an equal number of positive and negative. So what we see here is actually starting in 2014 here, we already have overall positivity across the European Union to immigration, the key being here, from other EU member states. So people feel relatively good about that, at least asked in this very broad, abstract, not particularly specific way. And what we also see is a degree of stability. The change that we see is secular rather than volatile. So we can see it's really basically a flat line. And that's notable for lots of reasons from an academic perspective, which we'll talk about. That means that from a purely measurement perspective, it suggests that the measurement is relatively accurate. We're not seeing sort of huge fluctuations that suggest that the surveys are picking up lots of noise. It also suggests that people aren't, at least at the aggregate level, reacting massively to context. And a lot has happened in this time period. We've had the so-called migration crisis, we've had Brexit, we've had COVID, and so on and so forth. Things that people have really, media have got very excited about what this says about attitudes to immigration, and so on and so forth. But yet we see across the European Union, on average, a gradual movement towards positivity. And what I think is also interesting is we see pretty similar trends across the rest of the Union. So if you look at all these other countries and the UK bottom left by itself there, we see a gradual move to positivity, a little bit more volatility, but not much. And the differences between the countries are notable, but they're very much fixed effects. So a country that starts lower tends to end up lower at the end of the time series and so forth. Now, the Eurobarometer asks another question, which we can compare. So, does immigration from other EU member states, which we just looked at, or outside the EU, conjure up a positive or negative feeling for you? So again, let's look at the EU average here to start with. So the red line is the same as before, starting positive, getting more positive. The line in blue is the net positivity to immigration from outside the EU. So we see in 2014 negativity quite clearly at the start of the time series. And then by the time this gets to, I last updated this in mid-2021, or more recently, the last updated data was from mid-2021. We see basically it reaching net neutrality. And I've looked at the last few surveys since then, and it's more or less that same creeping trend. So I did wonder during COVID, where you see this little bit of a downtick, maybe that was caused by COVID. And we actually do see a little bit greater variation by member state, a little bit in these blue lines, greater volatility. So it could be that this extra European immigration is more prone to context, but I still think the same rule applies of gradual secular movement, at least across the EU, this is a very high level, to positivity and fixed effects. So the difference between European and non-European attitudes, so attitudes to European and non-European immigrants, at the beginning of the time series here, it's probably about 10 points. And at the end of the time series, it's also probably about 10 points. So we really see a lot that seems to be deeply embedded in what's going on. Yeah.
Short question. So the EU does actually not really understand free movement as immigration, but as mobility. So why do they ask people then about immigration?
So I don't work for Eurobarometer, who does the survey, but that's a good question. And I actually had a paper reviewed once, and it was about Brexit, and I made the mistake of calling it European immigration, and the reviewer spent about 3 pages lambasting us for calling it European immigration. So I think you raise a great point. Yeah,
because it's a political the commission. No?
It is although they subcontract it to, though they write it, they subcontract the implementation and I guess the translation to polling companies in each country. You're probably right. Maybe they should change it. Yeah, maybe they should change it. But on the other hand, perhaps if it was conscious, it may be an unconscious error, or it may be that they thought, okay, a lot of people won't understand. I don't know, free movement or fellow Europeans or whatever you would call it. So we'll just tell them something incorrect instead. That could be what they were thinking. I don't know. Jamie?
Yes, but then again, you need also residence permit, even if you are a member, you are moving, then it is not. But I would like to ask another question. I think there are some interesting cases in the relation. The UK, which obviously in the moment of Brexit has very liberal positions, but then goes on. Italy, which is basically thinking, which was such a pro-EU country for many people, quite many, on the EU and people coming from Britain. And also within the Central European countries, if you look at the Czech Republic, but not Poland, quite like and Hungary is basically increasing the discrepancy between EU.
I was hungry here. So you managed to interpret a lot more from this than I did. That was amazing. So I'll quickly go through those one by one if I remember. So we've got United Kingdom here. That one, being British myself, I did notice more immediately. And I think what's interesting there, as you say, yes, is the rapid increase, which we've seen across the English-speaking world. You also see it with Ireland as well. But what's interesting about the UK, and this kind of comes to identitarian questions, and actually even relates to this point you made, is that the fixed effect is small, you see in the UK, between European and non-European. And I think that explains a lot of Brexit. So there was not a conscious understanding that, okay, this is in any way different. This is immigrants from the EU, immigrants from, let's say, the Commonwealth or something, there wouldn't be a favorability. You mentioned Hungary, so there's a lot of these country trends I agree are more interesting, and you can read a lot of, like I did for the UK, all kinds of things into them. Czechia, yes, and Hungary, they've maintained extreme negativity to non-European immigration. And I do think it's also interesting that Poland has sort of had this U-shape. You can just see it here. Yeah, I don't know if I know quite enough about each of those countries to explain those trends, but I think the overall thing you can say is that, yes, at the country level, you see greater volatility, and in terms of attitudes to non-European migrants, you see greater volatility as well, and probably greater country effects across time. Anyone else before I go on? Okay, so this is a really broad question. This is the two we just looked at. These are quite abstract, really. I don't even know if I'm going to bother with this actually, but so I'll quickly go through this. This is the ESS data from 2016. How many of each group should be allowed into your country? And what's interesting about this is two things. One is, this was an experiment, so people weren't asked about all of them. They were just asked about one at random. A quarter in each country were asked about one of these. And it's they were given 4 answers: allow none, allow a few, allow some, allow many, which is the ESS always likes to do that. And so we see, so the scale, the true scale is actually 1 to 4. But what I think is interesting is that it's not a surprise when you look at the 4 categories: European labourer, non-European labourer, European professional, non-European professional. What I think is interesting is not the extremes, because it's not a surprise that this yellow diamond is usually the least popular. That's non-European labourer. And bear in mind, people have all kinds of connotations, both about the non-European part and about the labourer part. And then I don't think the other extreme, which is usually in most countries, but not all countries, interestingly, European professional, that's not surprising either, because then you have the identity and the sort of economic and the broader connotations, probably even more importantly. But what's interesting in the middle, the preferences between European labourer or non-European professional. And usually we see this red triangle ahead, I think in every case actually. So at least according to this, you might think, okay, that suggests that if a non-European professional is preferred over a European labourer, does that mean that people are more concerned by economics than they are about culture? which as we will see shortly, goes against a lot of the literature. But it could be that people have these other connotations to do with crime and all kinds of other things that they would associate to certain educational and professional levels. Okay, I'm going to skip these. I don't find these even that useful. I don't know why I put these in. This is why I think things are more. This is where I think things get a lot more interesting. So we saw this stability in terms of general attitudes, in terms of whether people feel positively or negatively. We saw basic stability and a fairly secular trend towards positivity. Now, when people are asked something very unique, and this is something I've worked on a lot, what would you say are the two most important issues affecting your country right now? When we see the percentage saying immigration, we see a very different trend. So we see this is the EU here, affecting your country in red, confusingly the exact same red. So what do we see here? This is 2005, the trend goes back further to 2022, 2023, I did update this one. So what we see is there any way, I can't point it, is there a pointer here or not? No, I don't think so. So basically we see a trend like this. Stability, big peak, downward, and then a little peak more recently. That's how I interpret this here. So what the big peak, I think you can all guess. The left axis, as I said before, is the percent saying that immigration is one of the top 2 issues affecting their country. So this is all about importance, about prioritization. The big peak, unsurprisingly, around 2015, is the so-called migration crisis. And then we see, even though I kind of ruined it now, but you could see a decline and then a little bit of a rebound in the last 2 years. I interpret that in terms of what caused that. The key to this question is that psychologists say that humans can only prioritize politically and personally in their own lives as well, 2 or 3 issues at a time. And this question reflects that by being ordinal. It doesn't ask how important do you think immigration is, it asks what do you think are the most important issues affecting your country. So when other issues have come to the fore, COVID, the economy, whatever, it's actually pushed the importance of immigration down, it's depoliticized it. But of course, with those things fading away, we see a bit of a rebound. You can still see it on the blue line here. There's a lot to unpack here, but I'll try and make my way through it. Why this is so important is because we've seen the rise of the radical right, we've seen Brexit, we've seen all this stuff in 2015, 16, and so on. And we also saw more positive attitudes to immigration at the same time. And this is the way, according to me at least, of unpacking that puzzle. How could we have more positive attitudes to immigration but the rise of the radical right at the same time? So one way is that the shrinking anti-immigration group of voters who very recently, as we saw in the first slide, were the majority in many European countries, in many they still are the majority, but the shrinking number of anti-immigration individuals got highly, you could say politicized, or you could say their priorities changed during the migration crisis, and that was massively disruptive for Europe's party systems. I think in Switzerland maybe a bit less, although correct me if I'm wrong. So, okay, that faded away, and the radical right, to some extent, in the last few years have also faded away. At least their growth stopped, and in many places they got a bit weaker, not everywhere. But we see already this return, even though, as I say, I don't know if I can delete that or not. But anyway, we can see it in the blue line, not affecting your country, and this is something that's really interesting to me about how the radical right's changed. The radical right was very Eurosceptic before Brexit, anti-European, and we can see that people saw immigration as the most important issue affecting your country, more than the most important issue affecting the EU. After the migration crisis, those two have changed, and people see migration very much as a European issue. And we see that the blue line for the European Union on average is still very high. So 2 things. One, during the migration crisis, it overtook the national salience, that's what we call this measure, salience, and it stayed higher. And then, although it went down a lot, it's now quickly coming back up as COVID and other things go away. So migration is now widely considered a European issue, and it's becoming a more important issue. And we know that these conservative voters will reorient their voting to radical right party, I mean conservative with a small c, conservative-minded voters or reorient their voting away from centre-right or even centre-left parties to radical right parties during times of high immigration issue salience. So the third line we have here, besides most important issue affecting your country in red, most important issue affecting the EU in blue, is most important issue affecting you personally in green. And there we see a very clear trend that really, I think, undermines a lot of theories on attitudes to immigration, which is green is almost always rock bottom. Not only is it the bottom of the three, but it's often approaching nominal figures, like 5%, around that area, measurement error level figures. There's a few exceptions, Cyprus, Malta, but these aren't exactly heavy hitters when it comes to European politics. So that goes against the idea that people's attitudes to immigration are what they have in mind is themselves, ergo their back pocket or their job on the labor market, or all these things. So it kind of goes against that sort of more, as we say, egocentric approach to attitudes to immigration, and shows it being much more sociotropic and Eurotropic, if you will.
Couldn't this be also an indication for cultural stress? Basically, you're thinking of Europe against Islam, your countries, certain kind of immigrant. Whereas personally, you know, it's not affecting your position, not as much as it will change Europe. It will change.
I entirely agree. So it's sociotropic. It's saying I'm concerned about immigration because not because it's going to how it's affect me, my taxes, or something like that, but how it's going to change the wider community to which I belong. And people increasingly see, which I think matters from a policy perspective and an accountability and thus a voting perspective, Europe as the responsible body, the EU is the responsible body for this. So, yeah. Any questions on this before I go on? The Vice Chair. Okay, this is extremely small, the text here, so I apologize for that. Luckily, it's a relatively big screen. This is quite different, and I have to talk you through it a little bit because I don't have a legend on the side, just because the graph was so big. This is World Value Survey asking 60 countries across the world in the last 2 years, because it takes a long time to do it. They asked about 8 narratives about immigration. So I'll try and talk you through them. And this is net agreement. So it goes to minus 100. So to 100. The percent saying that they agree, again, just as before, minus the percent saying they don't agree. And we have 4 negative narratives up here. Increase the crime rate, increase the risk of terrorism, lead to social conflict, increases unemployment. And on the next slide, positive narratives, fills useful jobs, gives asylum to political refugees, strengthens cultural diversity, helps poor people establish new lives. Now, this might look extremely messy, and in a way it is extremely messy, but I want to draw out 2 immediate things that I think matter from these 2 graphs. And I should point out that the order of these countries, this is from the World Value Survey, the order is in descending order of positivity to immigration. So the World Values Survey asked another question, not here, about positivity to immigration, how many people the government should allow in. So bottom line, Andorra at the top here is the most, was massively popular. They were like, yeah, let people in, as long as there are jobs or something like that, let people in. And then at the bottom, we have Malaysia. And then we have 60 countries in between. Now, what's interesting to me, these are the negative narratives. We can see some correlation between the position, how high the country is, and how the net agreements. So basically what I mean by the correlation, I mean, you can kind of see the dots kind of go like that, but it's very messy. And that makes sense. Okay, you would expect there to be higher net agreement about negative narratives about immigration in countries where they want immigration less. That makes perfect sense. That's not a surprise. But to me, it's not so much the correlation that's interesting as 2 things. One is that it's messy, by which I mean, even in these super pro-immigration countries, let's take Germany here on this line, we see, yes, they disagree with one of the narratives that they say, no, it doesn't increase unemployment, this orange square here. Can you see the dot? Yeah, when I hover, yeah. So they say, no, it doesn't increase unemployment. Most people don't think so. But you have big majorities agreeing with the other three. So I found this one absolutely amazing, and it actually inspired me to write a short paper because I just thought it was an incredible finding. So people are thinking, what a loser, but that's okay. So increase the crime rate here and increase the risk of terrorism. People agree with that. They say in Germany, yes, we're pro-immigration, but we believe these narratives. And then incredibly, this was like plus, I think it was plus 70, the net agreement, believe that immigration leads to social conflicts in Germany. And this is of the 60 countries or so, this was like at the 5th or 6th most positive attitudes to most positive immigration policy preferences in the whole group. Even in plucky Andorra here, you see nearly net agreement on leading to social conflict. And in Great Britain, the second most positive, you see net agreement on, even though they have massive majority saying that they are pro-immigration, they believe it leads to social conflict. And we even see, so I found this interesting. So the main reason I found this interesting is one, because of where the dots are on this line. So they're mostly to the right. People agree with these negative narratives, even in anti-immigration countries. That's the first thing I found interesting. Two, they use really original measures. So I've heard the ESS has done measures on crime, the ESS has done measures on all this stuff, but I never heard of anyone doing a measure on leading to social conflict before. And I thought that captured a lot of conservative concerns about immigration. Now, why this becomes more interesting to me is the next slide. So we see on all of these narratives, most people in most countries agree with almost all of these narratives. In short, there are very few dots on the left side of this line. But when we look at the positive narratives, we see literally the same thing. So people are capable, so you can interpret that in one of two ways. One is survey research is a load of nonsense and people will just agree with whatever you tell them. But that seems a little bit unlikely for a few reasons. One is that we had this correlate, we have some level of correlation here again, but also people were giving positive or negative answers about their policy preferences. So it could be, rather than people having very simplistic binary opinions on immigration, that they're capable of holding and believing nuanced things about immigration simultaneously. So we can see that almost all of the positive narratives are agreed in almost all of the countries. So I looked a lot at Germany before, so let's look at Germany again. So here we go. Every positive narrative: green fills useful jobs, blue strengthens cultural diversity, and then just massive agreement for these two: gives asylum to political refugees and helps poor people establish new lives. We see massive agreement of those things. So long story short, when it comes to narratives, you probably shouldn't judge attitudes to immigration in a country by belief in narratives, even when measured in surveys, but presumably then especially not on Twitter and all that, because people, that just because someone believes that immigration has had some negative effect or positive effect doesn't mean that they're respectively negative or positive about immigration. So with bottom line, nuance is the lesson for me here. Okay, I'm going to move on to the literature now because this is enough on just raw data. But all I want to show here is, and everyone here is going to know this, but I didn't know of the level of this. So we have normal distribution. So not that many people at the extremes. This is the perceived effect of immigration on the economy across all the European Social Survey countries. Not that many people say it's very negative. Not that many people say it's very positive. But most people can choose. There's more people either negative or positive than there are neither. Like, it's not everyone's in the middle either. So people can choose a side, but they lean one way or another. And we also see between 2002 and 2015, this also needs to be updated, a degree of positivity, like movement positivity. This goes up, this goes up. Arguably also a little bit of polarization, because the moderates went down in the very middle, and this and very negative went up. But overall, we see a movement towards positivity. So this is effective immigration on the economy. Next, on quality of life, really same story. Normal distribution, few people at the extremes. Effective immigration on culture, normal distribution, skewed, but still normal. now on the count, sorry, there's only one or two more of these. This is skewed negative. And crime, this is the most negative of all. But we still see a movement towards positivity.
This is before the migration.
This is during the migration crisis. It's actually 20. Oh, wait, hold on. No, you're absolutely right. It was just before the migration crisis, 2014, 2015, I think. I'm pretty 2014, 15. Yeah, it was. And there is a new one afterwards, but it hasn't really. The reason I didn't update it is because the change is so minimal. Okay, so now beyond any questions on the data part before I move on to the literature? Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question. The first one is about the if I remember correctly, all the data we had the time like that maybe also about the nuanced reason, yeah, how do they have the same, they think same type of treatment from
Sorry, I couldn't quite hear the first bit I got from the second slide or the second issue.
the second part is about the nuanced gene they have immigration. When they respond to the kind of survey, they have the same idea of are they responding very kind of
I think it's a great. The second question is more difficult to answer because, and it's a great question because of that. The first question is a bit more easy to answer. So that's when was this taken? So this was 2017. So I don't have one of these at the UI, so I'm quite enamored by it. So this was 2017, I think, to 2021 or 2022, something like that. So you're right, it's a big gap in terms of when these countries were measured. And yes, that could affect the answers they give. It probably did affect the answers that they give to some extent. Yeah, I don't know what else to say to that, except probably right. And then whether people have the same thing about immigration in mind. So what they have in mind when it comes to immigration. This is a really interesting question that comes up quite a lot. And I think it's relevant for all research, survey research beyond immigration, attitudes to immigration. So first, do they have the same thing in mind? I'd say it's quite easy to answer, and I would say probably no. And then second, but I think the resulting question, the more interesting part is that a problem? Because if they truly have the same thing in mind, then they'll end up having the same attitudes, presumably, I guess. I mean, the mind is a complicated place, so they have a lot of things in mind. So I think it's going to be that they have a different thing in mind, and we should think of what that is. And the survey questions can help us draw that out because they do have these things in mind, perhaps. It could also be, this is purely descriptive data after all. If we're doing explanatory research, we might want to do all the normal things you do when it's like, you know, controlling for the context that they're in, or maybe get a bit clever about it and think about the type of migration flows, or as all kinds of things people have done, like the national history of wars or how the nation was formed and all kinds of stuff, because that affects how you perceive outgroups as well. So I think they do have different things in mind, and I think that's really important, and we should think about if that matters at all, because it could even be a good thing. I don't know, you know, but I mean, I don't know if anyone else has any ideas on that, but we can talk about it some more later.
Thank you.
Okay, so beyond descriptive data to, in some ways, the more boring stuff, but in other ways, more interesting stuff. So I call this tools and integrated theory because this section, so there's 3 sections of this presentation. This is the second one. This is really the overview of a paper I've just written. And the aim was to produce an integrated model of attitudes to immigration. And one of the main reasons is that there's so much on attitudes to immigration now. So I started working, at least working in earnest on attitudes to immigration in the start of 2017. And really the literature's come a long way since then. I mean, just in terms of volume, but also in terms of the approaches and the prejudices that people hold and the methodological rigor and so on. And that's had lots of good things. These, I'd say, are the good things. Big advances, more identified factors, increasingly sophisticated indirect and interaction effects, and some debates seemingly settled even, which we'll talk about. It's also had some bad effects, I think. So it's meant that as the literature's proliferated, the findings have become scattered and rooted within subdisciplines. And I think that's a theoretical issue, and that's how universities organize the issue, but it's had an empirical result, which is bad, which is that all of these effects, everyone's producing these thousands of papers with all these wonderful effects, and they can't all be right because only 100% of variance in attitudes to immigration can be explained. So that means that probably some of these effects that they're finding are really picking up other stuff, despite these weird and wonderful new methods being used all the time to try and isolate causality. So there's likely an overdetermination of attitudes to immigration. The other thing is, that's related to that, is the relative factor distribution and ordering has been largely overlooked. And that's something to do with how publication works in universities, as many of you will know, or I think probably all of you will know, that as we're going down this causal pathway, more and more desperate to identify causality, we're getting more and more thin and eventually brittle results that aren't looking at the big picture at all, because we're just building on these advances all the time. So what that means is, to some extent, how all this stuff works, all the stuff we've mapped, how it all works together has been largely ignored, because you're going to get the top journal article by isolating that tiny causal factor. You're not going to get it by writing the paper I just did, which is sort of an overview of the literature. And I said, okay, this is kind of the big point, as I said already, attitudes overdetermined. Okay, so what I did in this paper was firstly classify the literature in 4 ways, which I'm about to walk you through: socialization, explanations, psychological predispositions in political psychology, economics, media and cueing, and context and contact. Okay, so the rest you'll see after I've done that. Okay, so what I would say is, when I first started, the attitudes to immigration literature was reaching the end of a period where for a long time it had really focused on these 3 things. Contact theory and still is to some extent, a massive or commonly used explanation for attitudes to immigration. Communication, particularly cues from politicians, the media, and to a lesser extent, context. So, you know, migration flows and what's the broader migratory context at the time. And this is all great, and this is all important, but it has some assumptions that don't really match with the data I showed you at the start. The first is, all of these assume we live in a world of attitudinal volatility. So that means that the reason that it assumes that they're volatile is that these can change all the time. You can have contact with a migrant tomorrow. You can have received political cues now. The context can change tomorrow with a crisis or who knows what. So they all, because they're so external, put the individual, your attitudes, in a position of high, I don't know if vulnerability is quite the right word, but yeah, let's say vulnerability to the external world, and thus they are volatile. They're also all, the second point, migration focused. And this is a problem with the whole migration literature beyond attitudes, is that migration researchers tend to treat migration as somehow special, as a policy issue, and thus they look at the causes and effects in migratory terms. So the assumption, therefore, is that if you're assuming that people's attitudes to immigration come from contact with other migrants, and you don't assume that their attitudes to, say, redistribution come from contact with other migrants, which I do think would be a pretty unreasonable assumption, then you're assuming that the formative processes of attitudes to redistribution and attitudes to migration are distinct. And that's fine, except the fact that they're highly correlated and people form political parties with a high degree of predictability between their attitudes to immigration and redistribution. They also assume constant updating, and they assume that attitudes primarily don't vary by individual. How much time do I have, by the way? I think I'm going over here majorly. They assume that attitudes to immigration vary primarily by context. Why? Because all of these are external to you. So they're all going on in the world around you. If you live in Hungary, a country where indeed it does vary quite a lot by context from here, then you have a completely different news system. You have a completely different, all this stuff, migratory context and so on. Okay, so that was until I would say, let's say 2010-ish. Then I would say the big approach since then, and most of the findings have been on the second column. And I think that could be broadly called socio-psychological. So this has almost exactly the opposite assumptions on each of these four things. In short, rather than seeing the external world as flooding you in a very effective way with what causes your attitudes to immigration or otherwise, this could also to some extent be used for other attitudes, it rather sees your inner world as a lot more powerful. And your inner world, according to this, comes from two things: your psychological predispositions, which is your inner world, and the place that those psychological predispositions come from, which is your early life socialization. So the norms, identities, and so on that you pick up early in life, and that they don't disappear afterwards. What happens in your childhood stays with you in a way that what happens in your day-to-day life as an adult really doesn't so much. That's much more water off a duck's back, at least according to this school. So the assumptions, therefore, are stability, i.e., because it's all about what happened in your childhood, and your childhood is now over, those causes remain. That attitudes to immigration are strongly linked to broader political attitudes and worldviews, because that childhood has an effect on all your other stuff, and those norms you picked up, the school you went to, and so on, the country you were raised in. Result of early life socialization, psychological predispositions, I already said. And according to this, rather than vary primarily by context, most variation is by individual. So you can have two individuals who have a pretty similar background, or no, not background, who live in a pretty similar, let's say, city, and they can vary enormously according to the attitudes to immigration. Now, that was, I'd say, the last 10 years. And I'd say the thing we need to do now is to try and find a way to bring these two together. Like, how can we reconcile these quite different theoretical approaches? Okay, so because we haven't got that much time, and I want to go to the third phase if possible, I'm going to really storm through this this next bit. So, four groups I mentioned of explanations. The first two are that socio-psychological. So the first one of those is early life socialization. Three big factors that have been used in that, and there's been some great papers recently on these. First of these is higher education. That one's been looked at, obviously, for a long time. That's quite bread and butter. But we've become a lot more clever and have better methods to test three causal mechanisms by which education, in particular higher education, affects your attitudes to immigration. One is liberalizing, the idea that you go to university and they give you all these woke, norms and make you, they brainwash you to some extent. And then the next one is cognitive ability, that you go to university and, equally absurd, it makes you so smart that you just figure immigration out and you've got it now. And then the last one is self-selection. So that's a different type of people. This is talking about higher education. Different types of people go to university, then go to not university. And so what's the evidence looking like on these? As I say, I'm going to go through it super quick. Mixed, long story short, and that it highly depends on the content. So the reason we know that, one reason is that there was this great paper from Taiwan not that long ago, and because Taiwan is faced by the threat of China, because we're talking about more and more, they've really introduced this highly nationalist curriculum. I don't know when it was, maybe 10 years ago or something like that. And someone did an experiment looking at that, and they showed that doing that has actually made the Taiwanese much more anti-immigration, because now they have this higher education curriculum that puts an emphasis on Taiwanese identity. So that's just one paper. I don't want to generalize too much from Taiwan, but it kind of gives you an idea of how it can work in both ways. The other thing is that it showed that all of these educational measures operate via trust and threat perceptions. I guess I don't need to highlight literally everything. Okay, so higher education, one of early life socialization. Next one, heterogeneity during childhood. If you grew up in a culturally diverse childhood, whatever that would be, you grow up more comfortable with immigration. If you grew up in a homogenous country, and this is the sort of thing we saw in Central and Eastern Europe, dare I say, in terms of attitudes to immigration, then you're a bit warier of heterogeneity. Though some have argued, looking in France, that that's declined a lot over time. But actually, that was a big thing in sort of separating maybe my generation from my parents' generation, because I grew up with a degree of diversity, my parents didn't. But then the generation that are coming up now, these effects have declined because everyone, it's not like it's continuing. It's not like people are getting more pro-immigration because of this. If you see what I mean, I'm not sure I'm supposed to be clear on that. Because everyone now is growing up with some diversity. The homogeneous nations spell has been broken. Okay, and then the last one related to that, national culture during childhood. So that's related to this heterogeneity, but all kinds of social psychologists have come up with these measures of national culture. So I'm not going to go through them all, but collective cultures versus individualistic ones, ethnic versus civic, national versus international. And the evidence here is pretty good, that yes, indeed, if using these schema, putting countries on these, this is things like Hofstede, people like Schwartz's 2004 paper on cultural values, and so on. Using the schema of 7 or so cultural values is a strong predictor of national attitudes to immigration. Okay, next, psychological predispositions. So as I said, I'll try and go through this quickly. Probably the most famous of these is the big 5 personality traits. Many of you will have heard of that. So that's agreeableness, openness. Before I go into this, I should briefly mention that attitudes to immigration are themselves psychological. So all of these have a big theoretical assumption, conceptual assumption, that there's like policy attitudes which exist up here, and then there's some other stuff in our brain which is like deeper and bigger and harder to move, and thus causes the other thing, which is a pretty wild assumption, although one to some extent I'm quite willing to go along with, because probably people do have what we can roughly call predispositions and then more specific stuff, but separating that is not easy. Anyway, so the big 5 personality traits is the most common schema, I would say, that's been used in terms of individual psychological predispositions. And 4 of them, openness, more pro, conscientiousness, more negative, agreeableness, I can't remember now, and neuroticism, I also can't remember now, they all have effects on attitudes to immigration. The one that doesn't is extroversion. However, despite the strong evidence, all of the psychological predispositions, all the psychology stuff always has strong evidence because they're so, as I mentioned, endogenous. But these are highly moderated by things like threat perception and ideology. So, which makes sense. So you have another layer in the brain. So you have your predispositions, then you have things like threat perceptions and so on, ideology, and then you have your attitudes to immigration. So it's a little bit of a, although it's empirically supported, theory behind it is a bit of a stretch. Despite that, this is what I've worked on quite a lot, which is basic human values. So that's the idea that people vary in their broad motivational goals in life. These can be measured, particularly by Schwartz's 1992 schema, basic human values, he called it. And there is strong evidence, but again, numerous contingencies. Cultural values, we actually looked at here. This is where the two come together. So the cultural values are not your values, it's the values that everyone in your country somehow has and you were given early in life. Strong evidence, but again, numerous contingencies. Moral foundations, very famous by Haidt. That's been criticized a lot. We can talk about that more. And then we have 4 big ones that have great evidence and I think are probably even more reliable just because the data is like so consistent. Trust, these are predispositions. So the amount that you are willing to trust strangers. Risk toleration, the amount you're willing to tolerate risk. Need for closure, so that's your ability to tolerate ambiguity. And threat, how do they phrase it? Perceptions, I think it's called, or some willing, the ease with which you're threatened. This has a strong physio-psychological component. So the amount that your palms get sweaty or something if you're watching a horror movie. Okay, I'm not going to go any more into this because I want to move on to the lecture. If you have any questions at any point, again, feel free to ask. Okay, and then we have something which was a kind of a bit old-fashioned. I'm not a huge fan of, at least I don't think it stands up or theoretically makes as much sense because the measures are so similar to political attitudes. But right-wing authoritarianism and social dominance orientation, probably the 2 biggest political psychological schema or factors, have been shown, unsurprisingly, to predict attitudes to immigration. I'm not such a big fan because I think that these come pretty close to being political attitudes themselves. So the endogeneity makes me a little bit less comfortable than it did here. But there's other political psychological things that I think are more likely to, at least, that are a bit more reasonable theoretically. So consciousness of social identities, national commitments and attachment, political trust, and of course, your ideology. But we're really getting into endogenous territory by the time we get there. Okay, 2 more of these, and then I'll quickly go through some papers and wrap up. So, economic explanations, long story short, as with all political science, because of Marx, because of whoever, this is the knee jerk that people start with. And the evidence really hasn't been that good, at least until quite recently, that people's attitudes to immigration are formed by implicitly, the assumption is basically economic hardship leads to anti-immigration attitudes because they're kind of angry with the world or they feel threatened. And it's been tested so much that we have all kinds of subgroups. Personal economic situation, sociotropic economic situation, like the Swiss national economic situation. Objective or subjective. Existing, so my current, or potential if we let in more migrants. And then the big one, which has been around since, I suppose, the rise of the Nazis, which is that recessions lead to greater xenophobia. And yeah, mixed evidence, small effects. But some recent papers have kind of pushed back. Like there's a little bit of a comeback here. Some of the recent papers on labor market competition, I think, are quite convincing, actually. Okay, and the final 2, media effects and queuing. This is, we all know this, the idea that people get their attitudes to immigration from newspapers, from politicians, mixed evidence, small and highly contingent effects. And finally, context, the big one, contact theory versus group threat. This is a really interesting one that I think is one of the few that has been settled. So the contact theory is the idea that if you meet migrants, if we just meet migrants, then we'll suddenly become more favorable to migrants. And the problem is that we haven't met them. And then group threat is the opposite. It's the idea that you see migrants in the street and you're like, oh, like, I don't want any of that. The way people have quite cleverly reconciled these 2 or synthesized them is that it's highly contingent on the intimacy of contact. So non-intimate contact, it seems like, leads to group threat, seeing people in the street, that kind of thing. Intimate contact leads to greater positivity. So that's work colleagues, things like where you actually have a conversation for more than 10 seconds. Okay, so there's a lot of findings out there. Just in the last few years, there is thousands of papers. It's just ballooned as a topic. And I argue that despite the fact that I said that attitudes to immigration are probably over-determined, that we don't have to necessarily believe that all of these aren't right. They could all be right. And that's because multiple causal mechanisms are related and indeed reliant upon one another. So the big, certainly since around 2020, there's been some really great new papers, and they've really been focusing on this reliancy, which means, for example, long story short, like the effect of my contact with migrants could be positive or negative, and it relies on my own psychological predispositions, or it relies on my own upbringing, or it relies on that kind of thing. So these contingencies, interaction effects. So all of these may have direct effects. So all of the things we looked at, this barrage of causal ideas, may have direct effects on attitudes to immigration, and they may have indirect effects. They may affect, your childhood. By now, probably doesn't have much of a direct effect. It's much more an indirect effect. So it's going through. It affected if you went to university. It then affected if and who you married. It then affected if you had children. It affected a lot of stuff in childhood. So most of its effects are indirect. What we can see, according to those groups, what I propose, is we see some of these effects, like those from childhood, early life socialization, are distal. They're a long way away. But we keep seeing that they're big. So the effect of what happened early in your life it matters a lot. And especially with childhood, it's hard to change, or if not impossible to change. Others, for example, media cues, political cues, recessions, economic crises, are proximal. They happen now, and then they go. And the effects are relatively small, and they're easier to change. Maybe not the economic crisis, but the cues and things like that are easier to change. Okay, so the way I recommend, when I did my PhD, I started out looking at voting. And there's a very famous theory, and that's still used now, called the Michigan model of voting by Campbell et al. 1960. And his model was this funnel of causality. So for him, voting was here. And I've changed it. Attitudes to immigration here. And then you have these distal effects, strong and stable, and these proximal effects, weak and stable. And you have things here like childhood, values, deep stuff that makes you who you are. And that affects things you do later, way before you even get to your attitudes to immigration now. It affects whether you went to university or not, let's say, or whatever. And so there are these indirect effects. There may be these direct effects. And then there may also be what you can kind of call, if you can make sense of that, interaction effects. So the two can interact in interesting ways. The effect of this can even change the effect of the other thing. This is a monster of a slide, the next one, so forgive me, because I've put all this literature onto this, and the results are horrifying. But if you spend long enough, then you can kind of make sense of it. So we see here psychological predispositions, early life socialization, the socio-psychological approach, I call it. And you have these social and cultural values kind of in between. And these affect each other. So your psychological predispositions are highly contingent on what happened earlier in your life. Then you have later life socialization, which hasn't been looked at that much. But you also have this intermediate psychology, which I mentioned. So this goes here, this goes here, this goes here. Political psychology, economic interests, contact cues, and so on. And you can see all of them are having these direct effects on attitudes to immigration here. And they're also having indirect effects happening through this crazy mess along here. So the other thing which I didn't mention, and I don't want to go into detail, but the other big weakness of the literature is the idea that there are attitudes to immigration, which, as we saw at the very beginning, when we looked at the narratives, people's attitudes to immigration are nuanced and mixed up. So I at least start with thinking about beliefs, feelings. Attitudes in theory have a cognitive and an emotive component. And then after that, stated policy preferences at the end. So that's my attempt at an integrated model. It's my first attempt, and the paper is still being worked on. Okay, very quickly before we wrap up, because I'm way over time, going to just quickly go through three recent papers and one forthcoming, or one data that I hope becomes a paper. This is super simple and super quick. So this was a recent paper with myself and colleagues on the effect of public attitudes to immigration in the aftermath of COVID-19. And if you were paying attention at the start of the lecture, you can guess what I think the effect is. So we looked in Europe and the US, and bottom line, little change in policy preferences, big drops in issue salience. So the politicization of immigration and thus radical right, etc., fell because people, why? They can only handle a few issues at a time, and COVID was just taking all the oxygen out of the room. That means that if COVID is going to have any impact on attitudes to immigration, it's likely to emerge via early life socialization and value change. So it's going to be, there may be an effect of COVID-19, but it's going to be visible in a very subtle way in terms of how we live our life and things like that over the coming decades, probably a generational effect, because particularly those people who were young during COVID are going to be especially affected, whereas the rest of us, like myself, who's already an adult, was pretty resilient to suddenly changing my mind because of COVID. Okay, next one, European attitudes to refugees after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Myself and colleagues, 5 countries, panel data, it's in West European politics now. We see stability over time descriptively, and we see basically 2 things 50-50 affecting attitudes to Ukrainian refugees. One, predispositions to immigration, which fits in with the socio-cultural, socio-psychological approach, and attitudes to the war. So this matters in a few ways. One, you can say it matters because context matters, but it also highlights that when it comes to specific attitudes, which is what life is ultimately about, different attitudes are not that separable from each other. Yeah, okay. Last of the recent papers, this is upcoming in Political Public Opinion Quarterly. We look at the effect of the rise of the radical right on attitudes to immigration, and we find a positive relationship. So we argue that that little bit of greater positivity to immigration that we've seen in Western Europe, particularly, and across the European Union on average, is partially because of the rise of the radical right. And the reason is negative partisanship is placed anti-immigration sentiment in this minority, associated it with them, bit of polarization, and a desire to re-emphasize anti-prejudice norms. So people are alarmed by what these parties represent, and so they really want to emphasize, actually, no, for most people at least want to emphasize that they're relatively pro-immigration, or at least not as anti-immigration as these people.
But the current debate in Germany is going in the other path.
That brings me next to this survey, the data I got from Germany in last week. So this is a little bit more specific. I wanted to explore this narratives idea more, move away from this idea of do you feel positively or negatively, and explore this very specific narrative, which to me is notable and alarming because it's not so radical like the Polish plumber, I guess, in Switzerland and wherever else you're all from, you're aware of. That was an anti-immigration narrative in the early 2000s that was essentially economic. I would say it was a radical, that was anti-immigration for sure, but I wouldn't call it extreme. Whereas I would say that this great replacement theory is extreme. This is the idea that there's a sort of conspiracy by, who knows, to, or insert here, to replace so-called white Europeans with insert group here as well. So it's a pretty dark theory, not only because it's anti-immigration so much, but because it assumes that it's conspiratorial in short. Soros would be one, but again, it's context, the narrative, it's not a story, it's a narrative. So that can be put elsewhere. You take Soros out and you insert here whoever you want. Okay, so we did a battery. I tried to devise a battery of questions, and I did it with an NGO. So there was a little bit of horse trading about the exact wording of the questions. So if you think the wording of the questions isn't good, that was the bit that the NGO wrote, not the bit that I wrote. So we did 8 questions, and we tried to start mild and get more extreme. And we asked them the extent to which they agree that this is the case on a 0 to 10 question. And they wanted to be very softly, the NGO. And I really wanted to hit people on the nose with the narrative as I understood it. I unpacked it theoretically, deconstructed it, you could say, and then tried to put each of those building blocks into 8 questions. And people were asked on a 0 to 10 scale whether they agree with it or not, each of the building blocks. And so here's this is not a great presentation, but here's the national average. So this is the first, what I would call more mild, though in some ways still relatively concerning. If the current migration patterns continue, the white population in Europe will soon become a minority in their own continent. Now, aside from demographic projections, I would say it's relatively radical, if not extreme, because of this component, which we purposely put in their own continent. So it associates ethnicity with territory. And even you could argue like this idea that this racial idea, basically racial understanding of people. And the majority of Germans agree with this, according to the data we got. This was provisional, this is early, but it was a representative sample of Germans. It wasn't just like, it wasn't a convenient sample. So it should be reasonable. And this was the most mild. So that's why it's got the highest agreement, but I still think that's something. Okay, immigration, this I kind of stole this from the World Values Survey and tried to make it a bit more narrative-ish. Immigration in the last decade imports conflict to Germany from the Middle East and Africa. So we see even higher agreement, most people agreeing with that, just like we saw with the World Values Survey. And now we're moving into, this is so the NGO is like, I mean, you could basically call it a pro-immigration NGO, but they work a lot with Islamic organizations and so on, and they have a very integration kind of mindset. So Islam is not compatible with German society, so continued immigration of Muslims will lead to a divided society. 5 is the middle, the scale. So we see a majority agreeing again, or at least if I don't know if strictly that's not necessarily true, although that is true, a majority agreed with it. 5.9 means that the average score is over there, is on that side. As the white population becomes a minority in Germany, it will be harder to maintain order and our way of life. We see agreements. The replacement of Europeans with immigrants is a deliberate plan by a global elite. This is what we really were like, okay, let's see what we can get out of these people. The replacement of Europeans with immigrants is a deliberate plan by a global elite acting outside of the government control. So there's 2 things here. There's the conspiracy. There's also this. I don't consider that actually so important. But I wanted to introduce an undemocratic element. So the idea that there's nothing we can do about it, at least not through democratic means. And because this NGO is very concerned about violence, I won't go into details, but if I interpreted, okay, if people think that change can't come about through democracy, if it's being cheated somehow, you could argue that if you believe this, that legitimizes to some extent political violence.
But this is a bit counterintuitive because in conspiracy theory, like the government and the logic involved in the conspiracy, and
it could have been sovereign people.
But you know what? I initially wrote
Democracy was also like a figure that was figuring in this conspiracy theories in Germany, you know?
I wrote democratic control. What they did, the survey was in German. I don't know if they wrote democratic or German, but when they translated it back to me by someone who wasn't involved in the survey, they wrote government control. It may have been democratic control, which I do agree would be better. Because the point, what I was trying to capture was that you can't change it by voting. Yes, maybe it muddies the waters. As the questions get more extreme, they also probably get less well measured or less well constructed. Regardless, I still think that 3.8 is a very high average score for, I mean, a ridiculous.
A similar question, but then with the government approval or something like that. Did you have a similar?
We didn't. But I mean, it's a good point. Yeah, I didn't think of that. But maybe we can do that. This was just from the first attempt. Okay, this is what they really wanted. But anyway, the left liberal elite in Germany are naive Gutmensch, who support, or shouldn't it be Gutmenschen, who support the globalist plan to replace Europeans with immigrants. So they were trying to capture this specific idea. So because they work as part of a group of NGOs, they're concerned about the perceptions of NGOs. We also asked a lot about perceptions of NGOs in the survey. So this is even higher. I don't like this that well because I think it captures two potentially separate things. But anyway, it's still pretty high, I would say 4.5. Okay, and then we asked two more prosaic questions at the end. I have heard of the so-called Great Replacement Theory. Not that many people have heard of it, 3.3. And by the way, I just assumed everyone here would speak German, which is totally, which I don't, but this in English would be do-gooder. That's what we said. I don't know, in your languages, you probably have something similar. It's someone who is trying to help and thinks that they're great by trying to help, but is actually making the situation a lot worse. Okay, so the so-called Great Replacement Theory describes the current reality of ethnic change in Europe, so 4.1. So there's a few problems with this data. One is that they're affirmative, and we were thinking, because we're measuring narratives here, not a scale of attitudes, it's quite difficult to come up with negative wording for a specific narrative unless we said like, does not for each of these, but that still wouldn't have been that, I don't think would have been that good. Anyway, I still find the data quite, I was actually quite amazed, especially given if we go all the way back to the first slide, the supposed move to greater positivity, especially in Germany. Okay, so to conclude, stability, greater positivity in policy preferences, normally distributed. Salience more volatile, narratives are more complex, and people are capable of multiple and nuanced beliefs. Massive explanatory literature, increased consensus following advances, likely overdetermined need for combined models. Predictably, the effect of COVID is fairly muted, according to my approach and data, that what didn't strike us as a surprise. And predictably, attitudes to Ukrainian temporary displaced persons were stable over time. The effect of the rise of the radical right, positive on attitudes to immigration, at the aggregate, maybe less so. But despite, until this is me from 2017 to a few months ago, not all is rosy in the garden. So we do see this extreme rather than radical emerging narrative. This is just one we looked at, the Great Replacement Theory. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought about how the radical right is changing in some ways back, but now with far more electoral consolidation, with Meloni, with Vox in Spain, to a more extreme and less UKIP, if I can say that, kind of, oh, we really just don't want to join the euro or something, you know, like, so there might be some link there. Okay, that's the end of the presentation. Thank you very much.
We have some time for questions. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I think it's been very interesting going on the issue of my seat, like, and considering the time of the day it's today. I was thinking the graph you showed, like, you go back on the five slides.
The funnel.
Yeah, so one thing I was thinking is the lived experience of like migration experience. And I'm thinking like at the beginning we had the graph of the Europe and others. And I'm thinking like the Schengen Agreement and the EU Human Directive before, and doesn't this have an impact that maybe you could go live somewhere else yourself? And then there's the like EU Human Paradox that if you want to go yourself, but you don't want others to come, other EU citizens to come your country.
I think can I answer straight away? Or do you have any other questions? Okay. I think it's a great point, and it's certainly a whole nother box that could be put in here, which I hadn't thought about, which is not so much policy change, because at least in my mind, that's a relatively short-term government by government thing. But certainly these bigger, when it comes to Europe, Schengen, things like that, these sort of borderline constitutional aspects, I think would be distal and do have these long-term effects that then affect all this other stuff. I mean, I moved to the EU for the first time when the UK was still a member of the European Union, and then I moved to the EU again later when the UK was still a member of the European University Institutes. And it's not a member of either of those things anymore. So maybe going back in time, we can see, yet I'm still here. If I was coming through now, that might not be the case. So I hadn't thought about that. And I think that's a really good one. I don't know what I would call it, sort of migration policy setup or something like that. But I think it's a great point. Yeah, policy, these kind of big structural constitutional policy issues. Jamie?
Yes, I like this picture, but I think it refers also to, I mean, we historical to the Horkheimer's idea of authoritarian seminar, the psychological predisposition in the early age,
Yeah.
and also how you are socialized. At that time, obviously, in the early 20th century, there were violence in families, much more. I hope so. At least much more dispersed. And for that reason, they were looking at the predisposition of all these people who were basically working for the Nazi Party, which had obviously a long-term effect how you see the world and how you also look at it. I think this is also the invitation to think more about youth, about basically young people, children, and how to interact with children and how to change long-term ethics.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Then the question that and it's about the last study on interested in the distribution because right now, as I believe you showed the
These are the means, yeah.
yeah. How should we that? How is it that and also regarding that question I have another question. It was said the 1 and 10, right?
I actually can't remember. I know 5 is the middle. Does that mean, I can't remember if it was 0 and 10 or 1 and 10. One of the two, anyway.
So it was yes or no question.
These questions. Oh, sorry. All of them were 0 to 10. Yes. And I agree that, yeah, this one really shouldn't have been 0 and 10. Is that what you were saying? Yeah, exactly. That was just for survey design, but that's life sometimes. Okay. So on the distribution of responses, I haven't actually looked at it yet. We just got the data last week. We're going to present it to their coalition at some point. And so I don't know. I mean, we can have a quick look on my laptop after this if you want. But my guess is that they would all be skewed normal distributions, but maybe not, which would be scary. So so yeah, well, I'll have a look. That would be interesting. Yeah.
I had a question. So at the end, one of the outcomes, like living together, you can go back to that graph that we
The funnel one.
yeah. So yeah, one that we were looking at. Yeah, that one. Yeah. So I had a question about well, I'm not sure I quite understand it, but it's very interesting. But also, like the psychological predisposition in the early life socialization, you know how you kind of think of those. Like, I was just wondering, like, I guess how do you measure as well, like when it's a societal cultural values and identity between psychological predisposition and early life socialization,
And you mentioned something about generation as well, like obviously your parent generation being different and like the younger generation. But I guess like, what I'm saying is I don't understand if it's like because you could still you have very much like left-wing liberal like Guardian readers who still have like a fear threat like response to migration in a sense, and like especially with Islam, separate maybe in some ways from how people see like racialized migrants, that they see like religion and being like them and stuff. Like how would you like those three are all kind of and somewhat linked together? I'm wondering like how do you kind of differentiate between people whose cultural social values might be around openness, free movement in the EU, for example, but then actually their migration section?
Yeah, so as far as I can tell, there's sort of three weaknesses that you raised, and I would agree with you that they are all weaknesses. So the weaknesses, I think, would be that we're explaining this thing on the right here, at the very last, this thing, stated policy preferences. And maybe I should have put stated policy preference, because I think that for every type of immigration, you could have a separate one of these. So as you say, Islamic, EU, whatever it might be. So I agree that this wouldn't capture that. The second thing is, theoretically, this is just a heuristic. I mean, I wouldn't call this a theory. So Campbell, the guy who did this for voting, specifically said, this isn't a theory. This is a theory building tool. So just a way to combine lots of other people's theories and like say to academia or whoever, this is basically a heuristic of how it's working according to what everyone's found so far. This is how it links together. And so it's highly imperfect, not least because we've got so many moving parts here. And I've been quite generous about including some of these, which maybe shouldn't, in terms of the empirical evidence. And then, so that's the sort of the accuracy. And then the third thing is that this is, you mentioned about, different, for example, a Guardian reader who has high levels of trust or something like that, I think, right? Or low levels of trust. Yeah. So 2 points on that. One, empirically, all we're doing here when we're predicting someone's stated policy preferences is drawing on average relationships across the entire, whatever the population is, let's say the UK. And so we look at how we do a representative survey of all British people, and then we come up with a model that is pretty imperfect, that don't take into account of those people that well in terms of the relationships. That doesn't mean that you can't plug in. So by that logic, you'd be left. So if you run this model with a representative sample, you would then have all these numbers, each of these arrows, millions of arrows here, because there's so many combinations, maybe not millions, but you'd have a couple of dozen arrows linking all of these, would have the effect, which is just a number. If this goes up by 1, then the thing next to it that it's pointing to goes up by whatever that number is. So you can then plug in everyone's, Guardian reading and high risk sensitivity, I think you were pointing out, so low risk tolerance. You can plug all that in and you would get a prediction. But the prediction will be based on the average relationships across the observed population. So it's imperfect empirically, it's imperfect theoretically, if it's even a theory, and it's imperfect in terms of that it can predict at a specific outcome, not at all these attitudes to immigration, which I suggest are nuanced anyway. So I think those criticisms are fair, basically. But it would still be better than what's been done so far, I think.
Yes. Okay. Well, thanks. That's a great presentation and a lot of good insights, I think. So I have 2 points. First, I was just wondering how you actually manage to read and synthesize thousands of studies in this super extensive field of immigration attitudes, so maybe we can also learn something from that. And my second point is on the conspiracy beliefs. Very much like that you look beyond the second classic attitudinal items, and there has been done quite a bit in most recent times, and they often find this kind of very impressive shares of people who say that they believe, but there's also some kind of growing evidence that suggests that this kind of misperception and conspiracy belief tend to be.
You're talking about the paper by Molly Roberts that came out a few weeks ago, or no, maybe last year or something like that.
Could be, yeah. So that's I think that we tend to overestimate this kind of share, because as you said, people tend to give affirmative answers in survey, and also we don't really know the strength of their belief or how certain they are of their answers. So I think it's good to continue this line of research and trying to find also better measurement instruments. Something I was wondering more specifically was whether you looked at how consistent kind of the individual answers are. So
on the Great Replacement.
The ardent conspiracy theorist that has believed in this lowest Great Replacement theory, is it also giving consistent affirmative responses to the other items, or does it show off like the theory from like a mild to the strong question items?
Yeah, so on the sort of critiques you raised of the having all affirmative, I totally agree, and I think that is a reason for less concern over the radicalism of the results. That maybe if you gave some reverse wording of this, that people would agree to that a lot as well. So yeah, in terms of levels, I think that's a totally fair point. I think I raised it during the presentation, and we should do more to sort of counteract that. I do wonder, and it's maybe partially because I haven't done this that much before, I don't think it's been done that much before, that when trying to, I really made a conscious effort to theoretically treat this Great Replacement theory as a narrative, and belief in a narrative, and thus I wanted to measure the belief in the narrative, not belief in, not an attitudinal predisposition. So an attitudinal predisposition, I think you can put on a scale and be like, okay, left wing, right wing, pro-immigration, anti-immigration, whatever. Whereas belief in a narrative, that's a bit different, because narratives have multiple parts. They're not just like, I like this. It's not affect, you know? It has causal claims. It has assumptions about what actors are doing. It has all kinds of things, and that meant unpicking it. And I think the parts then become highly specific, and that's why these questions are, I think, more specific than you normally see. Maybe I'm just going on a bit of a tangent, and actually I could just find a way to reverse word it in future. I should probably do that. So point taken on that. And then the second thing you raised was the correlation between the outcomes, right? I think it was the correlation between the scores.
Yeah, you have an idea of how this are related to each other.
I just haven't looked at it yet. The only thing I will say is that we tried to make it so these bottom two questions, as has already been pointed out, are a bit different. But these initial 6 questions are meant to like become gradually more extreme. So like the first one is meant to be the mildest version of the Great Replacement theory, and then they introduce a conspiratorial element, then it introduce a social conflict element, blah, blah, blah. So I haven't looked at the correlation, but yeah, we'll certainly do that in the next few weeks. This is pretty much all we've looked at. We also did a segmentation analysis, but that was more for the communications approaches, communication strategy.
Questions? I see that Andreas has.
Can I do it now?
Yeah. You can
You hear me?
ask your question, Andreas.
Should I do this?
We have.
Yeah, hi. Thank you very
We
much.
can't hear you.
Not yet? I unmuted myself.
I don't know. This is.
Might be better just to type it.
Oh yeah. Can
I
you?
can also stand.
Oh,
Oh,
yeah.
there we
Okay.
go. Yeah.
Do you understand me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for the presentation. I really want to acknowledge what you put together here as well. That is an immense body of literature. I was wondering about your heuristic, because if I recall my my knowledge about attitudes toward immigration, I'm not an expert on the topic, but it seems to me that most literature is about group comparisons and changes in attitudes on a societal level, as you showed at the beginning. But I was wondering what your heuristic means for individual and sustainable change in attitudes toward immigration. So, because does it mean that societal change in attitudes only happens by generational replacement? Because I would think that attitudes are considered more malleable compared to predispositions, for example.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andreas, and thanks for the kind words at the start. And that also, you also reminded me of a question I forgot to answer, which is how I brought the literature together. And that's a mix of cheating and a lot of work. So one, I just used previous literature reviews, and then I updated those according to the last half decade or so. But that was actually still quite a lot because there's been so much in the last half decade. Anyway, to answer your question specifically, Andreas, I'm really glad that you asked that because it was maybe the most important thing I forgot to talk about. So your question was, okay, how do we see within individual change? How do individuals change, especially later in life? Because according to what I've been pushing a little bit, individuals don't change, or won't, or at least not after a certain age. So what's really interesting when it comes to that is the political communication literature. And by that, I mean experiments, and a lot of this is recent, experiments looking at how different pieces of communication, so this stuff, from media and politicians generally, how they affect people's attitudes more recently. And according to the heuristic, and why I think the heuristic can be useful also practically, is that this isn't saying that media and political cues don't do anything. It is saying that the effects are going to be relatively modest, but it's saying the effects can be bigger and better if you take all of this into account, because there are interaction effects, i.e., the same person receiving the same piece of political communication, celebrate diversity, let's say, European Commission, big campaign, something like that. Person X, who has certain psychological predispositions, they kind of like diversity already and they just hadn't thought about it for a while or something, is going to react in one way, whereas the exact same bit of political communication, celebrate diversity, if you are all about conformity, then you're going to hate that. So we're going to see these interaction effects resulting in these kind of changes. And I know because I work with the European Commission on they're doing a campaign prior to the upcoming European parliamentary elections. They're doing a huge campaign. Even in Switzerland, you probably won't be able to avoid it. So they're using this basically. We've come up with a theory, I published an article in 2020, arguing that you need to use the values, the psychological predispositions of not of yourself, because you're going to be full, a place like this, and a place like the European Commission is going to be full of diversity loving people going out into the world and saying celebrate diversity. And those people who value conformity, one of Schwartz's most important personal values, all the way back here, it's the worst thing you could tell them. So they're trying to come up with these communication styles that appeal to moderates, not by saying something you don't believe, saying what you do believe and showing how you can fulfill the motivational goals of people who have distinct motivational goals from yourself through what you believe. So it's a little bit of a sleight of hand, but I think it shows the practical and also, if you care, academic utility of a heuristic like this. And I think, to answer your question, that's where individual change does come about. Yeah, particularly via, I need to move this one. Sorry, Andres. So particularly via changes in beliefs and feelings. So the cognitive and the emotive component somehow operating together can, if you can get it just right, then I think people's minds can be changed. I don't know if that's massive, and I think we've seen that a bit in recent years.
You say, James, that this is also the reason why there are change of voter, people who are changing the party.
I wouldn't.
Because I mean, this will be in the next few years to come, obviously the issue. Different countries which have a right-wing or extremist strong past, they basically shift and become alternative.
So I'm going to go back to the start of the presentation for that, or near the start. I wouldn't say I don't think attitudinal change explains much in terms of electoral change. This explains far more, which is, I mean, you could say this is a type of attitude, but changes in whether you're pro or anti-immigration isn't going to change much. Changing the importance you see in immigration or all kinds of other issues that are associated with parties, immigration is associated with the radical right, changes who you go for. And that goes back to the big trend we've seen in European electoral politics in the last 50 years. So post-war, it was about social groups, that's how you voted. Then that broke down in the 70s, 80s, and so on. And then now voting is about your psychological profile. And what that has resulted in, especially in multi-party systems, in proportional systems as well, is rather than, so vote change not happening between right and left, but having these two groups now, right and left, and vote change happening in there. Greens, Social Democrats, maybe Liberals, far left, vote swapping, same on the right. And what drives that is this, not your attitudes, but what you see as the most important issue of the day. This is highly volatile. So yeah, if you're left wing, that's not going to change from election to election much, maybe sometimes, but not much. But if you see there's a massive environmental crisis and you're in Germany and the Social Democrat are making this up, Social Democrat Party is like, let's build more cars, then, you know, that salience of the environment in that case, will direct where you go. Vice versa, if you see the economy is super important, you might be like, yeah, to hell with the environment for now.
Yes, I think we will close the sessions. Thanks a lot again, James, for this festival.